Ellen Tauscher, who is a member of the Armed Services Committee, who is the chair of the New Democrats, one of the hardest working members of the California delegation, who will present. I yield.
Let me first thank my friend and colleague from California for her passion and her prescience and for her leadership, and also my other colleague, Barbara Lee, and for Lynn Woolsey and so many of my colleagues who have been indefatigable, unrelenting, and brilliant in their insistence that we continue to put pressure on the administration and the President specifically for the litany of mistakes that have been made in Iraq, but at the same time holding deeply in our hearts the fighting men and women that come from all of our neighborhoods, come from all of our communities. For your patriotism, I can't thank you enough, and for your leadership and friendship, I will always be indebted. Madam Speaker, I cannot and will not support putting more American troops on the ground in Iraq. I stand here today more convinced than ever that the President's so-called new plan to send over 21,000 additional American troops to Iraq will only lead to further chaos. My opposition to this troop surge is built upon years of hearings in the House Armed Services Committee, where I serve as subcommittee chair of the Strategic Forces Subcommittee, congressional briefings, and 5 trips to the region, including 3 to Iraq, witnessing the war firsthand and speaking with our troops and commanders on the ground. Sadly, the President has gotten it very wrong every step of the way, yet he continues to ask us to trust him. When the Republican-controlled Congress was rushing a vote to authorize the war in the middle of 2002's campaign season, I joined my friend Dennis Kucinich to call on the Republican leadership to take the politics out of the vote, take the decision to send our troops into harm's way seriously, and postpone the vote until after the election. We wrote to our colleagues in October of 2002, and I quote from that letter, "It is incumbent upon us to address the matters of national security and these decisions through reason and deliberate process afforded us by our Constitution. This becomes particularly important when these decisions could possibly mean putting our young servicemen and women in harm's way. This is not a process that can be rushed for the sake of political expediency." Close quote. Our best attempts failed. Congress was rushed to a vote, and we had no opportunity to sort through what we now know was the Bush administration's personal collection of cherry-picked or just plain false intelligence. The President made it clear that he wanted to rush to invade Iraq and prevent international weapons inspectors from finishing their job. I spoke out at the time saying, and I quote, "We must consider every peaceful alternative and contemplate every possible outcome before we turn to force." Our warnings were again ignored. In February of 2003, I co-authored legislation that would have required the President to submit a public report to Congress prior to initiating military action in Iraq. Our bill said the United States should not proceed with unilateral or preemptive military action in Iraq, but if we do have to go to war to disarm Saddam, Congress needs to be sure there are sensible plans that will not compromise our ability to prosecute the war on terror elsewhere or further destabilize an already volatile region. Close quote. That same month, when then Secretary of State Colin Powell presented the United Nations with the Bush administration's case on Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, I again said, and I quote, "I continue to believe that the United States should not proceed with unilateral or preemptive military action." After the invasion, I remained concerned about the Bush administration's rush to war, and in July of 2003, I authored legislation to create a select committee to hold public hearings to investigate several aspects of intelligence, including whether the intelligence supported the claim that Iraq was an imminent threat to the United States, about questioning the accuracy of intelligence that led the administration to believe Iraq was working with al-Qaeda, and questioning the role of the Office of Special Plans in the Pentagon. The Republican-controlled Congress at the time wouldn't allow my bill to see the light of day. In September of 2003, the President requested an additional $87 billion to finance the war. In response, I authored legislation calling for explanations, noting that, and I quote, "President Bush has not yet provided Congress with a detailed plan that outlines the strategic objectives of Operation Iraqi Freedom." I have sent dozens of letters to the President, Secretary Rice, Secretary Rumsfeld, and others over the last 4.5 years, urging them to explain our mission and exit strategy for Iraq. I have offered suggestions to stabilize Iraq and bring our troops home sooner. Yet I have received few answers. Last week, I watched the President plead his case to the American people, trying to justify why more troops will save his failed policy. But yet again, I was disappointed by the stubbornness exhibited by a president that has failed in Iraq every step of the way. I have stated throughout the timeline of the war that the Commander-in-Chief has the responsibility to define a well-articulated mission that has the support of the American people and an exit strategy to bring our troops home sooner and safer. The President has neither. Top military commanders in Iraq, the Bipartisan Iraq Study Group, and the American people all agree that sending more troops to Iraq will not end the civil war. They understand that we should immediately begin a strategic redeployment of U.S. troops in conjunction with diplomacy that forces Iraq's neighbors to step up as responsible regional partners. Adding additional troops further prevents the Iraqi government from taking responsibility for securing their own country. If the President sidesteps Congress, he does this at his own peril, and sadly he does it with the men and women of our armed forces and their families paying the highest price. This is why I am an original co-sponsor of the Meehan legislation that requires the President to ask Congress for an up or down vote if he plans to raise troop levels in Iraq. I am not advocating cutting funds for the troops while they are in harm's way, but I am an advocate of conditioning all further spending for the Iraq war based on the Iraqis meeting security and political benchmarks and establishing a plan for the redeployment of our troops. I will continue to challenge the President to abandon his flawed troop surge policy, and I urge all of my colleagues to do the same. We owe it to our troops, to the American people, and to our conscience. And I yield back the balance of my time.